Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event today. I'm Dr. Lao Zhang, Director of the China Center at the University of Minnesota. In a little more than 30 hours, a brand new year will arrive according to the Chinese calendar. It is the year of the ox. I would like to take the opportunity to wish each and every one of you a prosperous and successful new year, and since the pronunciation of the word ox in Chinese is new, so I will say Happy New Year. Today, we are presenting to you another spectacular lecture on China. It is a part of the Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S.-China Bridges Lecture Series, made available by Mr. Bob Griffin and his wife Kim Griffin. Bob and Kim donated $500,000 to the China Center to create an endowment fund for the establishment of the lecture series. Each year, we choose a timely topic with a focus on U.S.-China relations, and we invite well-recognized scholars, writers, or experts to deliver a speech on that topic. This is the 8th time that Griffin Lecture is presented to the public on the campus of the University of Minnesota. The Griffin gift has reflected their commitment to promoting understanding and mutual respect between the United States and China. It has also demonstrated their dedication to building a legacy for their children and for Minnesota. It is my distinct pleasure to take this opportunity to recognize Bob and Kim for their extraordinary contribution and to extend our most profound gratitude for their generosity. Please welcome. Now, please join me in welcome Mr. Bob Griffin.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yongwei, for that nice introduction. That was very nice. And Kim and I also want to thank you all for coming today. This is a wonderful turnout. We're very excited that everybody could be here today on such a wonderful Minnesota day. We also want to express a very, very, very happy New Year to all our Chinese friends and to everybody in the room. I think it's year 4,707, so quite a neat deal. We're very proud of our association with the University of Minnesota, and we're especially proud of our association with the China Center at the University of Minnesota. Yang Wei and his staff have done wonderful things. There are fantastic people at the China Center, and they have built some very wonderful programs, building bridges to China, both in the U.S. and in China. I don't want to take too much of your time, nor does Kim. We're very excited to get to the speaker today. We've spent some time with him just in the back room here, and of course read his book and seen him on TV, and he is fantastic, so I'm very excited to get to him. I just want to leave you with something that I've thought about and Kim's thought about and we've talked about for some time, that if you ever thought it was important to build a bridge to a country like China, this last year has proven that. So if you can, please continue to open your eyes and your minds to what a beautiful place that China is. With that said, I'm going to introduce Meredith and have Meredith come out. We want to thank you very much for coming today. Thank you very much.
Greetings and Happy New Year. Welcome to the 8th annual Bob and Kim Griffin Building U.S. Bridges Lecture. My name is Meredith McQuaid. I'm the Associate Vice President and Dean for the Office of International Programs here at the University of Minnesota, and I'm delighted to add my own welcome to those of Dr. Zhang and Bob and Kim Griffin. Thanks for coming out to celebrate, to listen, and to learn from one of the National Public Radio correspondents who may, in fact, be one of the most familiar correspondents to those of us in this room, people who attend closely to the developments, the news, and the events in China. And Happy New Year again. Happy relatively new 2009 and the not yet arrived Year of the Ox. It's really a wonderful time to be together, of course, all over the world this weekend. Chinese people, Chinese descendants, as well as non-Chinese, are beginning that long and joyful reveling for a new Chinese year, which, regardless of the animal, the number, the yin or the yang, we always hope will be one of happiness, health, and prosperity for ourselves, for our families, for our countries, and for the world. Typically characterized as a year for hard work, perseverance, and patience, the last Ox year was 1997. In that year, Bill Clinton began his second term as U.S. President, Tony Blair was elected Prime Minister of Britain, and Hong Kong sovereignty was restored to China after 156 years of British rule. Our last Year of the Ox was the year in which Lady Diana was killed in a car crash in Paris, Mother Teresa died in Kolkata, floods devastated Grand Forks, North Dakota, and East Grand Forks, Minnesota. A deadly train crash in Hunan, China, killed more than 100 people, and more than 2,400 people died in an earthquake in Iran. On a brighter note, the last Ox year was the year representatives from more than 150 countries met in Kyoto, Japan, to accept the Kyoto Protocol, an agreement to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by more than 5% by 2010. Among other Nobel Prize winners, Jody Williams of the United States was awarded the Peace Prize that year for her work in removing anti-personnel landmines worldwide. And Mattel Inc. in 1997 redesigned the 11.5-inch Barbie doll. She was first introduced in 1959, but in the last Ox year, she was redesigned to give it more realistic dimensions. And so we hold our collective breath, we cross our fingers, we say our prayers to our various gods that this Year of the Ox, on the cusp of which we currently sit, will provide us with much to be proud of and less to regret 12 years hence. This afternoon, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Rob Gifford to our celebration. As I mentioned at the outset, to many of us, Rob Gifford is almost a household name. Perhaps like me, you feel you already know him. As the voice from China for National Public Radio from 1999 to 2005, Rob Gifford kept us informed and kept many of us company in the car, in the kitchen, and in our bedrooms as we attempted to keep up with the many changes going on in that huge and fascinating country during a particularly exciting period of time. Mr. Gifford first went to China in 1987 as a language student, and clearly that must have paid off. His fluency in Mandarin, his deep understanding for and appreciation of the complexity of China made him a valuable asset to National Public Radio listeners. In addition to covering China, Mr. Gifford has traveled widely in East Asia for NPR, covering elections in Taiwan and East Timor, diplomatic visits to North Korea, and produced a range of features on everything from Christian missionaries in Mongolia to internet startups in Hong Kong. As many of you know, before he left China, Mr. Gifford spent several weeks traveling Route 312 in China, which runs from Shanghai to China's border with Kazakhstan, China's equivalent of America's Route 66. What he saw, what he learned, and what he experienced, he shared with all of us, first in a 7-part series for NPR called China Road, and then in a book by the same name. I'm sure that many of you here have read the book, but if you haven't, you might want to make that one of your Ox Year resolutions. It's fascinating, and it was included on many best of lists in the year 2007. It's a book, it is an enlightened and entertaining consideration of China. Currently, Mr. Gifford is the London Bureau Chief for National Public Radio. He's here now on this bitter cold but sunny day to share with us his insights. Please join me in welcoming Rob Gifford.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Meredith. Thank you, Yongwei and Bob and Kim, of course, for welcoming me here today. It's a privilege to be here and to be asked to give the U.S.-China Bridges lecture. I thought I'd just start by telling you briefly about yesterday. I was in Houston, actually. Sometimes I get asked to give talks, and I try and just put them together so I can hop over from London for a couple of days. I was in Houston speaking to a group of women, a women's group there, about 400 women, who were, some of them quite elderly, and as we were just going into the auditorium there, the person who was introducing me whispered in my ear, a lot of these ladies are close personal friends of the Bush family. So at which point I was like, okay, congratulations, President Obama, cut that bit out. Memorable week for the United States, cut that out. Iraq war comments, cut those out. And then, rather strangely, later on in the talk, I gave my talk, and then there were lots of questions. And unlike today, I think we're going to have questions at the end with the microphones. But there were lots of questions scribbled on pieces of paper. And so the ladies sort of brought them to the front, and I looked at them, and I was trying to answer them as they came in. And there was one scrawled in clearly a very elderly hand, and it said, "Are you Bob Griffin?" I just thought, I was just bizarre. I sort of, no, I'm not. Whoever wrote this, I'm not Bob Griffin, but I'm actually seeing him tomorrow, strangely. So that was my strange day yesterday, and then I got on a plane to Minneapolis. So it's a lot colder here than it is where I live, but it's wonderful to be here, and thank you so much for welcoming me here. So I am, of course, going to talk to you, yes, about the China Road, the book I wrote just after I left China. This journey that I took, that you can see on the map here, it seemed to me, as I was thinking about writing a book about China, well, I did the radio series first, initially, and then as I took the journey, it just seemed to me the perfect metaphor, really, to tell the story of China, a story of a nation that is on the move. 150 to 200 million people. That's what, 2/3 of the population of the United States, something like that, is on the move. It's on the road. It's going to the cities to try and make a better life. And so it's a great way to see China and to tell the Chinese story. I was trying to do it at the very grassroots level, right at the bottom of the food chain, if you like, the economic food chain, the people of China. And to tell the story of China in a way that was trying to bring to life the people of China, because I think that's one thing we very much miss in the West. We get a lot of high politics, we get a lot of diplomacy and financial back and forth and economic analysis, and of course that's extremely important. But I think China has very much been a place of a rather faceless place for many, I think. Going way back to the 19th century or before, you know, the coolies of the 19th century or into the 1960s and the Red Guards all waving their little red books, even to the present day, when we look at the factories of southern China and the thousands and millions of people in the factories. And I think we really tend in the West to see it as a rather faceless place. But of course, every single one of those people is an individual, is a human being. And in my reporting from China, what I've always tried to do is just to try to get across that these people are people like you and me. They have loves and hates and ambitions and hopes for themselves and their children. And so what I try to do in the book and what I hope to do today is just to introduce you to some of these people, and through their lives and the people I met as I was hitching across China and traveling on the buses, is to just introduce you to the people of China a little bit. Many of you already know some of the people. Some of you are the people of China. Introduce you to yourselves. And to try and just make China a bit more real, rather than just this sort of big bad country in East Asia that we've all heard so much about, but we're a little bit scared of. And in the process of doing that, talking about the people of China, yes, absolutely, to try and answer some of the bigger questions. And the question I put rather pretentiously in the book is, will it be greatness or implosion for China? And that is a big question. It may be neither, of course, but to look at that question and the question of really whether China is as strong as it seems. As we start on the journey, though, I'd just like to... Oopsie, that doesn't seem to be the right one. Okay, I think I'm going to zoom back. I think we've jumped ahead a bit far. Here we go. Sorry, you're getting it all in Chinese history in rewind. Okay, the map at the beginning of the road is here. Well, now you've seen the pictures, I'll keep the talk a lot shorter. So, here it is, China. On the journey, I'm just going to introduce you to two people. That just before we start off in Shanghai, I chose to go east to west, not west to east, because in many ways you know what you're getting if you're traveling west to east. You're following the yellow brick road to the Emerald City of Shanghai. If you go east to west, you're really traveling inland into China's frailties. It's a journey into China's frailties, which gives you a clue as to what I feel about where China's going. And as you go along, as I went along, 2/3 of the way along, there were just two characters who jumped out at me. Two of the best characters I met on the whole 2-month journey. And here's the first one. He's on the edge of the Gobi Desert, and I arrive in this town in the middle of the Gobi Desert. It's a 2-horse town. It's starting to bustle a little bit, even this far inland. It's called Zhangye, actually, and it's a place where Marco Polo stayed for a year, in fact, if you believe his whole narrative, which many do. I have no reason to doubt it. I don't know what he did for a year in Zhangye. I stayed one night, but I went out for a meal. Actually, I checked in. I'll tell you about checking into the hotel. This tells you something about China. I checked into the hotel, which was not a great hotel. It wasn't a real dive, but it was not fantastic. It was fine. But I went up to the desk, and this is a couple of years ago, of course. I went up to the desk and checked in, and in my most sort of patronizing white man voice, I sort of went to the guy on the desk. I need to use the internet, email and stuff, and just need internet. Do you have that here? And he goes, just shoots straight back. He says, certainly, sir. There's wireless broadband in every room. And I thought, okay, right, this place is further along in its development than I thought. So I've dumped my backpack, go out to find somewhere to eat, and this guy and his friend come up to me. And we go through the whole, what are you doing here? Not too many foreigners there. And then I say to them, so what do you guys do? And he lifts up his bag, which has got two kind of Chinese characters on it, and he says, oh, we're the Gobi Desert representatives of Amway. And so An Li is the Chinese name, and he had this bag, and he had his suit on, and then they took me to the evening meeting of Amway in Zhangye, which is where, everybody brings a friend. You can get a friend in to try and encourage them to join, and then they sell on to their friends. And it was this sort of almost evangelistic evening meeting. Not very big, about maybe 10 of them had each brought a friend. And it was just an amazing evening. We went through, and they were very keen to have me there, and they were sort of talking about our foreign friend and everything. I thought I'd just actually read you a little bit from the book, just to introduce you to this guy, because he's so wonderful. I should just explain to you here that, just to explain this piece, that this was the summer that the movie came out of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Brad and Angelina. So everywhere, all around Zhangye, there were these massive posters of Brad and Angelina, just to help you understand what then happens next. So then Renwei stands up to speak. In his earnest manner, he thanks Teacher Hu, the leader of Amway, first of all, and then thanks everyone else for coming. And then before beginning his speech, he turns to me and thanks Mr. Smith. I do one of those movie double takes in which I turn around to see if there's another foreigner called Mr. Smith behind me. But it turns out that it's soon clear that I am Mr. Smith. From that point onward, every speaker who stands up thanks Teacher Hu, thanks everyone else, and then nods to me and thanks me, Mr. Smith, our foreign friend, for coming. Perhaps they think that all foreigners are called Mr. Smith. Or perhaps even here in the Gobi Desert, people are confusing me with Brad Pitt. My grandchildren will remember my name, says Ren, getting into his oratorical stride, appearing to mean every word, because I am going to change my family's fortunes, right? Dui bu dui. Dui, 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 yes, says the audience. Yes, 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 amen. Finally, Teacher Hu himself stands up, whereupon Renwei starts a clapping pattern, as though he's at a baseball game. You can't choose where you were born, but you can choose your future, booms Teacher Hu, to murmurs of dui, 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 yes, 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 from the congregation. Don't settle for chabuduo, he says. Don't settle for more or less. It's not good enough for you. And so about 20 Chinese people in a rundown office building in a small Gobi Desert town sit and listen to a middle-aged former teacher's exposition of the Chinese dream. You too can do it. You too can succeed. You too can be empowered. You too can have the car, the apartment, the respect. The audience is listening and remembering, and they will get up the next morning and go out to work in order to realize what they've heard. For those who seize the opportunity, this is part of the seismic shift that is going on. The possibility now exists to dream dreams that might actually be fulfilled. It's starting to change China one person at a time and create a new nation, a nation of slowly empowered individuals. At the end, everyone applauds one another. Teacher Hu thanks the group for coming and says that now we'll divide into groups of 5, introduce ourselves and discuss the meeting. It's time to share, he says. 2,500 years of Confucianism and 60 years of Communist Party rule mean that Chinese people are not used to sharing in a way that seems normal in an American context. The Chinese in this respect are more like the British, if not somewhat worse, generally reluctant to open up about their emotions at all. That may be the reason that so many Brits stay so long in China. They're just relieved to find another group of people as emotionally dysfunctional as themselves. Just kidding about the Chinese people. 4 small groups of 5, plus the rather incredulous Mr. Smith, retreat to different corners of the room, huddle together and share. When the meeting ends, Renwei and Li Taijin escort me down the stairs to the front door. No need to see me out, I say, but in true, supremely polite Chinese fashion, they insist. It's amazing what you're doing, I tell them. I've absorbed the earnestness of the evening. I mean it completely. You see, says Li, taking me by the arm a little too firmly as we descend the echoey stairs, we want to live. Right now, we're just shengtun. We're just surviving. We want to shenghuo. We want to live, you know. We want to really live. Those words have stayed with me like almost no others on my whole trip across China. There could hardly be a better summary of everything that this crazy 21st century Chinese revolution is all about. Okay, I'll see you in New York then, or Paris, or London. I smile as we shake hands. They smile back, and we part at the main entrance of the building. I wander back to my hotel in the warm evening air, asking myself why on earth I'm leaving this wonderful country, and pondering the Chinese dream and the American dream, and wondering whether one is taking over from the other. So that's an introduction to him and several 100 million other people like him. And the main theme of his life is hope. And that runs right the way through Chinese life today. It runs as a theme right the way through my book. Not far down the road, though, a day's journey, I hitched to this place. It's a big truck stop in the middle of the desert. I'll just quickly introduce you to another theme and another guy. The crucial thing about this place is that there's a freshwater well there that has watered man and beast for centuries. Marco Polo probably stopped there on his way to China in the 13th century. And so I walk into a noodle bar here, and there's a guy called Lao Zhang, and it's as though he's waited his whole life for a white reporter to walk into his noodle bar and ask him how life is. And this is what he says. How is life? How is life? Life is not good. Do you know why? Because the officials have sealed up our well. The well that has given water to Xinxia for centuries has been sealed up with concrete. Why on earth would they do that, I ask him. Because, he pauses and steps back from the stove, wok in hand, to look at me, because they run the local water company, and they want to force everyone to buy their water. Even when you think you know something of the venal nature of Chinese officials, stories like this can take your breath away. Lao Zhang says he remonstrated with them, but they would not listen. He says they used the classic post-9/11 argument of government officials in Xinjiang, a region with a high population of Muslims. They said if I kept on protesting, they'd arrest me as a terrorist. And when you're arrested as a terrorist in China, you have no recourse, no lawyer, no protection. So Lao Zhang had to shut up, but he refuses to buy their water. Lao Zhang has a fire in his eyes that you seldom see in China. He doesn't seem like a normal cafe owner in a different era. I imagine he could have been a revolutionary. But here he is in the middle of the desert trying to make a living for himself and his wife and child. And then just to scoot down. So I say to him, so is there nothing you can do about it? I ask him finally. He stares at me intensely, beads of sweat rolling down his temples, and he holds up 2 fingers and says angrily, there's only one thing I can do, and I can tell you what it is in 2 characters. From the fire in his eyes and the barely restrained fury in his voice, I honestly think he's going to say, Goming, revolution. But he doesn't. 人手, he says, spitting the words out between his teeth. 人手, endure. That is all we can do. 人手. We can and must endure, and that is all we have ever been able to do. I stare at him and shake my head. He's just summed up thousands of years of Chinese history. Endure is all that the common people have ever been able to do. For all the progress in the wealthier parts of China, endure is all that hundreds of millions of common people in the poorer countryside and the western regions ever see themselves doing in future. At certain points in history, the endurance has become too much. The pressure has built up and the volcano has erupted. Revolutions have started and have overthrown the ruling dynasty. But they've not led to a change in system. They've simply replaced one emperor with another, with a new dynasty that ends up being just as corrupt as the last. There's never been any separation of powers, any linear narrative of change, any Magna Carta, just power concentrated in the hands of a few officials, trapped in an unending cycle of history. So that's the second guy and the second theme that runs through modern China, and it's equally as real as the first. The theme of despair that many people feel in the face of a one-party state. The hope is very, very real, but the despair is also real. And these 2 themes, I think, together, we have to take them together, because these are part of the contradiction of modern China. If someone tells you that modern China is wonderful, don't believe them. If someone tells you that modern China is terrible, don't believe them, because it's both of those things together. And it's that tension of the areas, like every country, of course, America, Britain, anywhere, has its good and its bad. But as I put in the book, if you're not confused about China, then you simply haven't been paying attention. You should be confused about China. You should be thinking, how can it be terrible and wonderful at the same time? Because it is. And as we just quickly now zoom back along the journey, I want to try and illuminate some of those wonderful and dreadful things and the tension between them that is really what shapes modern China today. Of course, the journey starts in Shanghai. If you haven't been to Shanghai, I thoroughly advise you to do so immediately. It's a fantastic place. It's really like Manhattan 100 years ago. It's a wonderful place to be. This is the Bund, the waterfront there with the Communist Party flag flying over a very uncommunist scene beneath it. Why does everyone want to get here? Well, because it's the Industrial Revolution in China. Think back to Manchester, England in about 1870. Charles Dickens. Think about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in about 1890. The Industrial Revolution has come to China, and it's transforming China amazingly. There are hundreds of millions of people in jobs like this. But in the West, we had more than 100 years for the dust of the Industrial Revolution to settle before the other great revolution, the technological revolution, came along. In China, they're happening simultaneously with about 100 times as many people. So it is an amazing time of convulsion, absolute convulsion. And these people, these women, are just a small part of it. It's a time of physical dislocation for them, of course. They've moved, many of them, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles across the country to find these jobs. It's a time of technological dislocation. It's a time of course, they've all got cell phones. They're all on the internet. I just updated my book 1 year on for the second edition. I had to update the number of cell phone users in China. First edition, last year, 452 million people have a cell phone. 1 year, that number has changed to 612 million. That's 150 million extra cell phone users in China within 1 year. You just run out of superlatives when you're talking about China. But this also is the first fault line of modern China. This is the first frailty of modern China. And especially now, since I wrote the book, what's happened in the last three or 4 months is really, really hitting China. And people are being laid off from their jobs. Millions of people are being laid off from their jobs. China's dependence on its exports is worrying many people in policy circles, in China and in the West as well. And so this fault line is a very real one at the present, especially as people now, just in the next couple of days, today, get on the train to go home for New Year. They might not have a job after the New Year. They probably haven't, many of them. What does that mean for social stability? What does that mean in a country where the only legitimacy of the government is economic? Nobody believes in Chairman Mao anymore. No one believes in Marxism. The only reason, perhaps not the only reason, but one of the reasons the people are not angrier than they might be about all the corruption that you've just heard me read about, is because their lives are getting a little bit better, or sometimes a lot better, every day. What happens if that ends? It's a major, major issue for the Chinese government, and a major fault line that I think we really need to pay attention to when we talk about the inexorable rise of China. With all the physical dislocation, and there is also psychological, emotional dislocation, moral dislocation, if you like. There's a complete change in the whole moral tone and the whole acceptable way to live from the 1990s, and of course the 80s and 70s before that. Any kind of nightclub you want to go to, any kind of bar in Shanghai, Hooters Shanghai, can you believe that? Hooters Shanghai. You can go in and have a burger served to you by her, and it's just no big deal anymore. So the nightclubs are full, the bars are full, you can wear what you want. Chinese young people are very similar to Western young people. I just gave a talk in Ohio, in a small town in Ohio last year. I was met at the airport by a young Chinese graduate student in her, she must have been 24, 25. And I went to China in the 1980s as a 20-year-old, and the gulf between me and the Chinese students was quite wide. And I said to her, "Wow, you're in America, what's it like?" And she just went, "Chabuduo," it's pretty much the same. It's like, what? She got her iPod, she's got a laptop, she's online the whole time, she's just like Western 24-year-olds. That's happened, it's changed, it's transformed. And that's a massive thing. But in this whole transformation, of course, there are many, many people who are wondering what on earth it's all about. What's life all about? My parents were told to believe in Mao. My grandparents were told to believe in Confucius, or Confucian ethics and traditional Chinese ethics. What am I going to believe in? And there is something, I think, of an identity crisis in China, of people not really knowing who they are or what it's all about. Now, that's not to say that that's not going on in the West as well. That's a part of the human condition, I think. But certainly in China, you feel it very intensely. And so the flip side of the nightclubs being full is that the churches are full also. There are more Christians in China now than there are members of the Communist Party. Amazing. 65 million people. Isn't that an amazing statistic? But as you leave Shanghai, here's the road, 312. It's not the business. I can't believe I've put in a photo with no cars on it. There are cars. There are cars on it, as well as pigs. And I travel 312, not because it's the most modern road. There's a freeway, a 6-lane freeway, about half a mile from here that runs parallel. But you can't get off the freeway. You just glide along above the ground. Here you can stop and talk to the pig farmers and ask them what their life is like, which is, of course, what I really wanted to do in the book. And as you leave the sort of megalopolis of Shanghai behind, you start to see a little bit of greenery. And then you emerge back in time, several hundred years. That could have been taken at any time in the last couple of hundred years, after the invention of the camera, of course. The guy with the plough and the ox. And this really is the second major fault line that you really feel as you're traveling across China. The development China is completely real. Shanghai is not some Potemkin village. Guangdong, where all the factories are not fake. They are absolutely real, and they are amazing. The Chinese government, to its very great credit, that it does not get enough credit for this, has lifted 400 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years, according to the World Bank. That is staggering. That's more people than the entire population of Latin America. But the scale of the country means that just leaves 800 million to go. And here's one of them, and it's a big issue. You can't deny the progress. It's amazing. But there's a long way to go. And for someone like this guy, his life is really quite difficult. It's better than in years past. It's better because his children are in the city. But all the benefits of the revolution, the benefits, healthcare was rudimentary, but it was free. And Mao doubled life expectancy within the first decade of the Communist Party being in power. Education, well, a lot of it was just brainwashing propaganda, but it was also free. And people learnt mathematics, and they learnt to write. Literacy went up. It was free. Now it's not free. It's being completely marketized. And on top of that, you have the corrupt local officials who grab the peasants' land and gouge them for taxes. It's the Wild West. If you're a Communist Party official, you can basically do anything you want. You can take his land, and if he complains, you send the thugs round to beat him up. Happens all the time in rural China. And that is part of the other fault line that you see going across China. Absolutely parallel with the wonderful, amazing things that are going on just down the road, in the same village even. And this is dangerous for China, because since 1989, the situation in China has been completely turned on its head. In 1989, we all saw the students and the intellectuals on the streets complaining, and complaining about the corruption, demanding political reform. But the peasants, who were only a decade out of emerging from the wreckage of rural Maoism, were on the up. They didn't take part. They were fine. They were happy to be selling their stuff at market. Now it's been completely turned around. The urban people have been bought off with great jobs. Bought off is a loaded phrase, but they've been given and helped to get good jobs by the government. They've got apartments, they've got cars, they've got a vacation in Thailand. Now it's the peasants who are angry. And if I were the Communist Party of China, I know which one I would be more concerned about. A few 100,000 urban intellectuals, no problem, as they very, very brutally proved on June 4th, 1989. A couple of 100 million angry peasants, big-time problem. And so that is why the government is pouring money in now to rural healthcare and rural education. They know they've got to, because they themselves emerged out of a rural revolution. They know what happens when you get a couple of 100 million angry peasants. So over the next 5 to 10 years, the crucial thing is going to be trying to improve his life, trying to get him more involved in the expanding economy and helping the rural peasants to be lifted out of poverty. Because if not, and we're seeing it getting worse all the time, there's going to be a lot more rural unrest than there already is. Big difference, though, of course, to the past. There's an exit. There's an exit. You can get on the road. You can get on your bike and go to the city. I often think of it as being like, in the old days, it was like a bird cage, life in China. You were in a bird cage. You couldn't really move. Everything was done for you. Everything was decided for you. What's happened now is that the Communist Party has been very clever. They've turned the bird cage into an aviary. So you can't yet fly up into the clear blue sky. Many people don't want to. But they have been given space to live. And the Communist Party has done an unspoken deal with the people of China. Stay out of politics, and you can do anything you want to. And guess what? After 40 years of having their lives convulsed by politics, the Chinese people bought the deal. So they're just enjoying, relishing the freedom to go and do whatever they want to. You can do whatever you want to. And so all along the road, you meet people in jobs that you would never have met them in 20 years ago, 15 years ago even. Karaoke parlors, the leisure activity of choice of many Chinese people. But of course, the karaoke parlors also often double as brothels. There are tens of millions of women in the sex trade in China. Wealthy urban men, poor rural women. That's quite a mix to put together. It's happened in every country as countries have developed, and there's a massive boom in the sex trade. This is just stopping by the side of the road. That's her marriage day, her wedding day. Red is the color of marriage in China. She's probably had more choice in husband than any generation of Chinese women. Choice. Choice is a revolution in itself. That's her chariot, and that's her dowry, actually, on the back. Great, you're just driving along, see something, jump out. Wonderful little snapshot of modern China. These guys a bit further along, this is up on the edge of the Gobi again, and I was in a car, actually, here, and in a taxi, and they were just biking along. And I stopped and said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're biking across the Gobi Desert." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "For fun." I thought, wow, that's amazing. Their parents' generation were traveling around the country smashing the place up in the name of Chairman Mao's Cultural Revolution. They're riding across the Gobi Desert for fun. Fantastic. It's not fantastic for everyone, though. These three guys are in a village in southern Henan. They and almost their whole village are HIV positive because of a government-sponsored blood-selling scheme. The problems of China, the Wild West nature of China, the local health bureau no longer getting subsidies from the government, has to think up a way to raise money, thinks, I know, we'll get the peasants to donate money, we'll sell the plasma to the pharmaceutical companies, but they don't know how to hygienically take people's blood. So they take the blood, take out the plasma, then mix it in a vat and inject it back into the peasants. Of course, you only need one guy with HIV, and the whole area is infected, and that's what's happened. And now the government is just basically waiting for these people to die, so they'll stop being a problem. And we had to sneak in there. I had to sneak in the back of a covered truck to get in there, because if we'd been caught, we'd have definitely been arrested. So it's not all plain sailing. Again, 1 minute you're thinking this is amazing, the next you're just thinking this is desperate. After the rural poverty, though, you emerge out into Xian, another island of urban prosperity, the ancient capital, the big city wall there. You could still march an army down that. Xian, there, only about a third of the way across. Xian, you can see it's the home of the terracotta soldiers, and just outside is the mountain of Huashan, which you can climb, the holy Taoist mountain. Taoism, the old ancient philosophy of China, it used to be spelt Taoism, T-A-O, but it's pronounced Taoism and spelt now D-A-O. and climb up there. And I climbed up there. It was summer vacation. I kept bumping into students, and I'd say to them, I was on a sort of little mini pilgrimage of my own. I was saying, do you know what Taoism is? And they go, oh, I'm not sure about that. Something to do with nature, is it? And I'd say, do you know what Taoism is? No, we're not taught that at school. And then I'd say, well, what are you studying? And they'd go, nuclear physics. And you just think, great little sort of microcosm of the Chinese psyche, just moving away from the traditional beliefs and getting into a bit of information systems engineering or something like that they're all studying. So I continued looking for a Taoist, and I actually found one quite by chance. I asked around, come on, somebody must believe in Taoism, and they said, oh, go and find the hermit. So I thought, great, a Taoist hermit. So he lives in the cave up there, and I hiked up through the woods, and it was boiling hot. And we sat down and talked about Taoism, and he told me all about the balance and the cosmic, the yin and the yang and the cosmic balance and the good and the evil and the male and the female. We had a great conversation. And then at the end I said, well, this is great, but I'm afraid I have to go. Could I come back sometime and maybe just monk out for a few days with you and maybe just talk a bit more? And he said, yeah, sure, that's great. I said, can I just show up? And he said, yeah, sure, just show up or call my cell phone. And he wrote down his cell phone number on a piece of paper and handed me the cell phone number. Great. So Taoists, hermits with cell phones. That's so modern China. Now we're 2/3 of the way across, really, and you start getting out of ethnically homogeneous China. You can tell she is not Han Chinese. Of course, she is Tibetan. And this is a very important point and a very important fault line as well. Up until perhaps March of last year, you might have said, haven't heard much from the Tibetans lately. And then Lhasa exploded. And the attacks by the Tibetans on Han Chinese were reported quite widely, and they were put down eventually quite quickly by the People's Liberation, by the police and the army in Tibet. This is on the edge of the Tibetan plateau. It's a town called Xiahe, and that's the Labrang Monastery there. It's one of the 4 most important monasteries of Tibet, of the Tibetan areas, right on the edge of the plateau. And of course, this is a very controversial subject. I'm sure if there are Chinese people in the audience, they're about to start throwing things at me, so I'll get ready to duck. It is a very controversial subject, and I am not trying to be a controversialist, but based on what my job is, which is going to places and asking them what the reality is, and not just believing one person, but asking many people, dozens of people, it's clear to me, take away all the propaganda of the Tibetan exile movement, which is, to be frank, sometimes quite distorted, it's clear that many Tibetan people do not want to be ruled by Beijing. As I say, it's often presented way too simplistically in the West, but there is clearly a very, very strong ethnic fault line here in China, that the whole western half of China is populated by people, many of whom do not want to belong to this country. Now, that's not to deny the many economic benefits that have been given to the people of these areas. More hospitals, is that a bad thing? Of course it's not. And so it is a very complex situation. But I think that this is the fact that the Chinese government and the Chinese people have not been able to make the Tibetans love them or want to be part of them is a big fault line. It's fine as long as the center is strong, which it is. Let's not underestimate the continuing power of the Communist Party of China and the People's Liberation Army. It is very strong. But the fault line is still there. And I think this poses all sorts of problems for where China goes if, for instance, it were going to move towards some kind of political change. Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, once said, in relation to the Soviet Union, that you can be an empire or you can be a democracy, but you cannot be both. And I think the country that the People's Republic of China has inherited has very much a sense of the old, it is essentially the old Manchu Empire of the Qing dynasty. And it can only be held together by force. If you move the People's Liberation Army out of here tomorrow, those people will be on the streets. And that is just, I believe, that is just a fact. I'm sure there will be some Chinese people who want to dispute that with me. Do raise a question afterwards. But it is a fault line, I think, there is no doubt. I just put that in because I love the idea of monks shooting hoops. They come out of prayers from the monastery. Half of them go on the basketball court, and the other half go into the internet cafe. So I don't know about the theology of Tibetan Buddhism, but killing people online is very popular on the war games sites that are used all over China. This is not so much a comment about Tibetans; it's a comment about information technology. Another very interesting contradiction, if not a fault line. China wants to be an IT superpower. It's doing pretty well in some ways. Better hardware than software is what people always say about China. But can you be that kind of superpower if you don't allow free access to information? If you don't allow people to think freely? If you don't teach them everything and don't allow them to explore everything? It's a big question. It's a very big question for the future and for now. Quick one just about the joys of traveling in China. This is a church. As I say, there are many Christians in China. And I was here on a Sunday morning. The itinerant pastor was supposed to come and preach the sermon. After about half an hour, it became clear he wasn't showing up. And someone came in and said, sorry, he's not coming. And everyone went, oh dear, that's a shame. Well, what are we going to do? And then suddenly one of them pointed to me and said, I know, the foreigner can preach the sermon. So that's a slightly slimmer version of me preaching a sermon in a small Protestant church. They didn't even ask me if I believed in God. But it's like, hey, white guy, preach the sermon. Again, you couldn't make it up, really. You really could not make that up. Briefly then, the last 1,000 miles, I'll zoom through this and then we can have some questions. Two more fault lines, I think. One is environmental. There is an environmental meltdown going on in China. And it is a very, very difficult situation. I'm afraid I'm rather pessimistic about it because of what I said earlier about the economic legitimacy of the government. If you're the local official there and the edict comes down from the Kyoto Protocol or its successor to Beijing with pressure from Western environmental groups to your local leader down to you as the local official, close down that cement works. And you're thinking, oh my goodness, that means laying 300 people off. That means loss in tax revenue. What are you going to do? I think you're not going to close down your cement works. You're going to do everything to keep the cement works open. And on top of that, there is the whole notion, which is you simply don't have an answer to, of Chinese people saying, oh great, so you can have your industrial revolution and become wealthy and have 2 cars and a holiday home, but we can't have ours. Is that what you're saying? And when they say that to you, what are you going to say? What are you going to say to Chinese people? The problem is, Andrew Carnegie didn't have Friends of the Earth on his case for day after day, and we managed to destroy our environment. Now it's just recovering. Unfortunately, if China doesn't do something more, we're all in big trouble. So I think it's beholden on us not to just point the finger, but to somehow work out a way to work together to solve a very, very big problem that is coming our way as well. So into the northwest, this is the old Silk Road. This is the Yellow River, the great symbol of old China. The road comes up here up into the Gobi Desert there, and it's a wonderful place. Again, it's a great place for a tourist trip. If you're looking for a journey, it's hard to beat the Silk Road, these old caves where there were wonderful frescoes. until the Western archaeologists came along 100 years ago and stole them all. And here's a wonderful chunk of Montana dumped down in the middle of the Gobi Desert. This is the Lake of Heaven. Wonderful place. China's a beautiful place. That is, yes, that's the final fault line. Resources. What are they going to do about resources? They need resources. They've got to keep peddling. You've got to create 20 million jobs every year, someone's calculated, just to absorb all the people coming into the cities. You need the resources. They need the oil. They need the iron ore, the manganese, the gas, the everything, the tin, the copper, in order to fuel this economic revolution. So far, they're getting it. Questions about China in Africa. Well, China in Africa is all about the resources. They need it, not just to develop the economy, but to keep the Communist Party in power. They only have this economic legitimacy. It's a big question. What happens if they can't get the resources? What then happens? What do they do? But the infrastructure is amazing. It is amazing. This is in the middle of nowhere. Not many cars on the roads yet, but better than traveling through rural India, I can assure you. Better than traveling through most of Africa. Amazing what they're doing. That's the guy I hitched with across the Gobi. The final pictures here, the new middle class at the end of the Great Wall, outspending their hard-earned dollars, renminbi, at Jiayuguan at the end of the Great Wall. And boom towns now in the Gobi Desert, the middle of nowhere. You've got apartment blocks in these places that previously were just nowhere. The boom has extended along the Silk Road, and the Silk Road is rising again. That's my bus that broke down in the middle of the Gobi, not to be recommended. And these are the Uyghurs, the people of northwest China, who in some ways, in many ways, are like the Tibetans in their attitude towards the Chinese government, the Han Chinese people, and the Communist Party government. They're Turkic people. They have more similarities with the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz of Central Asia, and many of them do not want to be ruled from Beijing. And there's a lot of, underneath the surface, there's a lot of seething discontent in northwest China as well. This is Asia Mainland Geography Center, which being translated means the geographic center of Asia. And this was the point furthest from the sea on the Asian continent, near the capital of the region called Urumqi. And this used to be the ultimate indictment of what a pointless, hopeless place this is. And I just put this in because nobody's there. Nobody cares. You know, they're all off making money in Urumqi. And so as the Silk Road rises again, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that this is the furthest place from the sea. For the first time since Vasco da Gama and Ferdinand Magellan, it doesn't matter because the Silk Road is rising again, despite all the problems going on in China. And the influence of China into Central Asia is very, very visible. And so that's the end of the road. And sorry, I've gone a little bit over time, but I want to just finish really with a couple of words to at least give some hints and do ask some questions of what I think about that question, greatness or implosion. I hope I've introduced you to some of the characters there and given you a taste. If you haven't been to China, I would thoroughly encourage you to go to China. And thank you once again to Bob and Kim Griffin for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this and just to give you a taste. And if you haven't been, do go. It's an amazing place. It is an amazing place. Discover for yourself what it's like. The big questions, greatness or implosion? Well, I think, of course, it could be neither. China could just muddle through, and it may well muddle through for the next decade or so. But I think, and I hope I've shown you a little bit, that I think that China is actually a little bit more brittle and a little bit more fragile than we like to think. It looks very powerful from the outside. It looks very strong. I think now, after 30 years of reform, we are starting to see the blowback, the fallout of 30 years of really scorched earth policy. It's amazing. It's fantastic. But don't get in the way of it. If your house is in the way of that motorway, that freeway that they want to build, or that hydroelectric dam, it's amazing what they're doing. But hey, let's move 1 million people to build the dam. It's at a very high cost to the ordinary people, even though so many people are gaining benefits from it. So I think there is a danger, and I fear there could be a crunch coming. That's what I fear. I think they can finance their inefficiencies for some time yet, in the short term, but you have a 21st century mobile economic society, mobile economy and society, and you still have a 1950s political system. It feels like something's got to give in China. And I'm worried because I think the government, quite rightly, is worried about launching down any path of political reform. They say they're not going to. And frankly, I can understand why they don't want to. Because I think all these forces, all these tensions, all this seething discontent or change, transformation that is going on under the surface means that they're afraid that if they start down that road, they could unleash something that they're then unable to control. And I think they're very right to be afraid of that. And I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that I think they're going to have to start to build some new pillars of the new house that they want to have and somehow resolve this identity crisis. What kind of country are you going to be? Because that has not been settled. It has not been settled yet what kind of country China is going to be. It can't go on, I don't think, as it is now. It simply can't, practically speaking. And so really the final word I want to leave you with is the word history. I don't want to end on too negative a note. I hope you can see that I am extremely upbeat and very positive about many of the things that are going on in China. And I do believe the Chinese government does not get enough credit for all these things. But I am worried, and I'd leave you with the word history, because Chinese history has really only ever been about reuniting, collapsing, get invaded, reunite, collapse. And what worries me is the question, well, why should the future be any different? I think Route 312 is part of the answer to that, because that is the difference. There's 150 million manufacturing jobs in China. Okay, they're losing some, maybe they'll gain them back. But there is an exit now. And I think that hopefully for the people of China, that the wealth that is created, they'll be able to share it and spread it to the people who need it, the poorest people, and to be able to take China in that way by also starting on some kind of political reform, very slowly political reform. Because otherwise I fear there is the danger that Chinese history could end up repeating itself all over again. I'd like to end there. I'm sorry I've gone a bit over time. Please do come and ask me some questions. I'd love to answer them. Thank you once again to the Griffins, and thank you all for welcoming me here.
Thank you, Rob. That was indeed a spectacular speech. Thank you very much. We have 2 microphones here. We would like to entertain a few questions. If you have a question, please come over to either this one or that one. We probably will be able to do 5 to 10 minutes of questions. Is there any question? Okay, please.
The people that you spoke to, what attitude did you pick up towards Taiwan and the relation between the mainland and Taiwan?
Good question. And I'm aware that I haven't gone into the international challenges in any way that China faces, which are many. I think the Chinese government has done a very good job of telling the Chinese people that Taiwan is part of China. In fact, they've actually done too good a job, in that the Chinese people now think, amazingly, that the Chinese Communist Party is too soft. Amazing. And the danger is that the Communist Party has actually painted itself into a corner slightly by saying if Taiwan does anything, we're going to attack. And that is a little bit dangerous. Tension has eased now with a new president, and I think probably it will be calm, all other things being equal, which they're not. So I'm reasonably optimistic that the situation in the Taiwan Straits will be okay over the short term now, maybe the next 2 presidential terms in Taiwan. And I think probably the thing that will change it may well be change on the mainland. The Taiwanese people are never going to accept being ruled by Beijing as long as it's a one-party state. But the interesting thing, sorry, to come back to answer your question, is that the Chinese people feel very strongly about Taiwan. It's a point, they're in the WTO, they've hosted the Olympics, they're getting the respect back that they feel they deserve, and they want Taiwan back. That's their territory, they feel. But it's a dangerous thing for the Communist Party to be playing with, because they may be creating an overly nationalistic populace, which in the reality of international relations, the government may not want to, in the end, invade Taiwan. But amazingly, they may be pushed towards some kind of action, if that ever came, by a more nationalistic populace. So, yes.
You mentioned free access to information, and I'm wondering if you think that the Chinese people know what they're missing out of, in a way. I studied abroad in Hong Kong, and my roommate, who was from mainland China, she had never looked up Tiananmen Square. Although she has freedom of access in Hong Kong, she'd never looked it up, and she didn't even think she was missing anything. And so do you think that they're missing anything, or do you think they know?
They are missing something, but you're right in that they don't know that they are, because Tiananmen Square has been airbrushed out of history. So you go up onto the universities, and also, I was 22 years old when that happened. So I was an adult, so it feels quite recent. But, you go to Beijing University now, that was before they were born. A lot of you guys, if you're a student, before you guys were born, if you're a freshman, probably. And I think there is a feeling, there is also a feeling in the West always that, the Chinese people, they must be just longing to overthrow the Communist Party. And if only they could get onto the New York Times website, everything would be all right. Or the Human Rights Watch website. And, Chinese people, as I'm sure you discovered, what did she want to do on the internet? She wanted to have fun. She wanted to get a good job, find a boyfriend. They want to do this space that they've been given to live in as just, they've grabbed it with both hands. And think about how politically involved people in the West are. Not particularly, unless there's something really bad. And people have just been depoliticized by necessity. They know they can't go there. So, and not only can they not go there, if they couldn't go there and there was no opportunity for economic progress, then they might get angry. But they can't go there, but they've got the whole candy store over here. So what's the point? And so, sure, that is slightly sad and slightly weird that you have a whole generation completely depoliticized. But I think that can probably continue for a little while more, because as long as the economy keeps ticking. But I think, again, I would say there's a limit to that. The point will come where something's got to give. But in the meantime, I think most people are just happy to have money and have a nice life and be able to wire. Yeah.
You mentioned at the end that China needs to build the new pillars for the new type of country that it will be for the future. What do you feel those pillars should be, and what would need to happen realistically for those pillars to be built?
Excellent question. It's a really difficult question, because one of the most important ones is an independent judiciary. That's the problem. You have two completely incompatible systems here. How do you get from a one-party state to a multi-party democracy? And I'm not saying China has to be like Washington. I'm not saying it has to be like Westminster. It has to find its own way, but there's no doubt, I'm with Winston Churchill. I mean, democracy is the worst possible system except for all the others. And I think that it's very much a case that they are having the amount of so many problems now that they need the checks and balances. And I think the key thing is an independent judiciary. Some kind, even if they don't. But the problem is, how do you institute an independent judiciary without signing your own death warrant? You can't. And I think Mikhail Gorbachev found that out very quickly. And they look at Russia and they think, we do not want that. I think the only way, and I'm not an expert, I think the only way is to slowly, very slowly, or medium slowly, start to try to implement more local elections at the grassroots level. They've done it in the villages, but the villages is not an actual proper level of government. It's just a village chief. And they've done it, and it was very difficult. If they do more of those and start to raise it up to the township level, which is the lowest level of Communist Party government, I think, again, they've got to start to try, because otherwise my great fear is something will come out of left field. Okay, we've got this economic crisis coming out of left field. Something worse might come out of left field. And the trouble is in China that the collapse of the dynasty has always often meant the collapse of the country. You know, if the Republican Party or the Democratic Party disappeared off the face of the earth, tomorrow, America would still function. It's got systems. It's got a legal system. It's got a bureaucracy. And so has Western Europe. China has not done that. And so it's doing what it can. It's sending people here to the University of Minnesota to study, to learn how to run a department of education, a department of health, a department to run a modern bureaucracy. So it needs much more of that. But the point is coming where they are going to have to take the steps politically, I think, because there comes a point where there's only one thing more dangerous than starting to hold on. It becomes more dangerous to not reform than it does to actually start reform. And I think legal reform is the key. Sorry. That's me just yakking on too much. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for being here. I was also a student in China last year, and I got to go to a lot of the same places that you did, so this has been really, really fun to watch. But as part of those studies, I recently finished a thesis on the role of the English language as sort of a global lingua franca in China. As I'm sure you know, there's a huge popularity of learning English among the young people, both in terms of the economic success that it can bring them, but also in terms of sort of this idea that they can use English to bring development to China as a whole. And I'm wondering what your perspectives are on Western and American culture linguistically and also more generally for the young people of China.
And its influence on the young people of China. Well, is it a good thing?
I mean, that's a pretty black and white question, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a global thing. Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of Chinese people learning English, crazy English. I don't know if you're familiar with crazy English. Brilliant. Get 10,000 people in a stadium and get them to shout English at the top of their lungs. I think it is a transformational thing, definitely, and it's helping China to integrate, absolutely, because you've got people using the language to integrate and to even read the New York Times website occasionally. I suppose it's. I think of it as very much part of just the osmosis of change. I don't think of it as some sort of massive revolutionary thing that's going on, but it's just gradually part of that change that is going on in China. And if you look at a country like India, where there's a lot of English medium schools, a lot of the middle class already speak English, it's definitely going to help China to be more competitive, to be more, in those industries, software, in all those industries in which India is very strong, even down to sort of call centers for banks and stuff. It's definitely going to help the economy, and it's undoubtedly going to help the culture to integrate. We don't. One of just final word, which is probably a good word to end on. I think there was a mad rush for English, as in Tiananmen we saw a mad rush to idolize America, put up a Statue of Liberty in Tiananmen Square. Interestingly, though, I've seen in the last few years, when I've been back and just at the end of my stay there, a Chinese desire to reclaim something of themselves. And just to say, whoa, okay, hold on a second. Yeah, we want to learn English, but you know what? We're Chinese, okay? We're Chinese. We're not going to throw everything else out. Our parents threw everything out. They destroyed themselves in order to save themselves, they thought. But now we're Chinese. We want to rediscover something of who we are. And that's a wonderful thing after all the mayhem and destruction. And so I think they're probably, hopefully, going to... It's a metaphor for the whole of what China's doing. They want to bring in the English language. They want to learn the English language. But they also want to rediscover something of themselves and their own language and their own culture and their own history. And with those two things together, move forward to face the modern world. We've got one more question. Everyone go. Do I think China will be able to solve its economic problems? Was that the question? I think, just to very briefly answer that, I think there's a certain amount of irony in, there must be a lot of smiles in Beijing at the moment after 20 years of lectures from American merchant bankers about how they need to loosen their controls on the economic levers of power because, hey, managed capitalism, good idea. Let's not go. So I think they are amazingly perhaps better placed. Yes, better placed to deal with the downturn because they are so much more Keynesian. I don't know how you say that in Chinese. They are so much more, the government is so much more involved in the economy. And they haven't gone down the road to as much as the West towards these sort of Wild West. It's Wild West in many ways, but not in terms of the financial instruments. So I think they are, I'm still worried, but I think over this year and next 18 months, they're not so badly placed, perhaps, as some Western countries. Thank you very much.